Chapter 1 by Darrell Pullman is that there are universal ethical principles that should govern the conduct of medicine and research worldwide. In his introduction, he talks about how in this chapter, Pullman is going to defend the claim that there is at least one universal moral principle that's been described in the history of moral philosophy as the principle of humanity, the principle of respect for persons, the principle of human dignity. Combining these aspects, the universal principle Pullman wants to defend is going to be called the principle of respect for human dignity. Now, he wants to admit that such a general principle is abstract, and it's not immediately clear what it captures in terms of moral content, or how the principle would be applied to give moral guidance in specific cases. However, he says we cannot simply assume the existence either of some universal moral principle or of any specific requirements of morality, because there are those who deny the existence of both. It's important to argue for these claims. Now, the opposite view of his he calls particularism, and it's the view that there are no general universal moral principles that apply to all cultures. Pullman wants to say particularism is like one or more kinds of ethical relativism or moral relativism. And the structure of his article is this. In what follows, he's going to describe the current debate between particularism and universalism in moral philosophy, which has been going on in various ways for much of the history of Western philosophy. Then, the latter part of this chapter, he's going to elaborate the claim that the very notion of morality requires at least one universal moral principle, which for present purposes will be labeled the principle of respect for human dignity. Okay, so let's first look at the historical aspect of the article. He first notes a little bit about the contemporary doctor and philosopher Edmund Pellegrino. In recounting the history of recent bioethics, Pellegrino divided the history of medical ethics into four overlapping periods. First, the quiescent period. Second, the period of principalism. Third, the period of anti-principalism. And fourth, the period of crisis. Now, I won't review each of these in this summary, but what I want to point out is that whether or not we now are in a period of acute moral crisis is a matter of perspective. This is a quote from Pullman. Those who are anti-principalists, those who are particularists, will not see the current state of moral knowledge, whether in bioethics or elsewhere, as a matter of crisis. But other people will say, look, there is an important unresolved debate today that makes today kind of like a crisis period in needing to establish moral knowledge. Now, the position that Pullman wants to defend here in his essay is that the very idea of morality requires the existence of at least one overarching moral principle that he calls the principle of respect for human dignity. All right. So he gives us discussion of the emergence of the concept of human dignity in history, beginning with ancient Greek and religious sources, moving on to Renaissance sources. And then he notes that the challenge for many 18th century moralists, like David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and their contemporaries, was to reaffirm morality on a non-religious base. Pullman says, we mean to convey, when we talk about dignity in a certain manner, the idea that all human beings have basic moral worth, irrespective of any contingent, historical, traditional, or cultural circumstance. One does nothing to earn basic dignity, and one can do nothing to lose basic dignity. Just being human invests a person with this basic moral worth, irrespective of their rank or station. Now he's going to contrast that with some other views of dignity in a second. He says, our concept of morality is predicated on the assumption of the intrinsic moral worth or dignity of humanity. The essence of morality is to guard, protect, and advance this fundamental value. The essence of this conception of dignity is that people have a right to be treated with dignity. The essence of this conception of dignity is not, says Pullman, that people have a right to be treated with dignity, but rather that people have rights because they have dignity. Now, what about Kant? How did he help us understand this? Well, Pullman says the story is mixed. Kant wanted to articulate dignity like this basic dignity in non-theological language. However, Kant's attempt to establish the universal basis of morality on a non-religious ground, says Pullman, Kant's view ultimately failed. So he gives an example of one of the problems with Kant's view. In Kant's view, to tell a lie, even to a murderer, in an attempt to protect innocent victims, would be to treat the murderer merely as a means rather than as an end. And Pullman says it's this kind of inflexible application of principle without any consideration for the contingencies of actual life situations that has vexed many particularists. So how does dignity get applied in moral particularism? Well, Pullman says, although appeals to human dignity still figure prominently in various contemporary bioethical documents, conventions, and treatises, such as those he had talked about earlier, the concept of dignity often receives short shrift in contemporary bioethical discussions, especially in the United States. Now, Pullman says that he shares two philosophers' views, Callahan and Macklin's, about the nature of morality and the need for some underlying universal moral principle. However, Pullman says that he does not share these philosophers' aversion to the concept of human dignity. So he thinks the idea of human dignity can be this needed moral ingredient. Now, Pullman contrasts his own approach in some ways to the approach of Kant. Pullman says, I argue that basic dignity functions as a meaning constraint on moral discourse. What does he mean by this? Pullman says, I mean that the very notion of morality entails a commitment to the fundamental moral worth, that is, the dignity of all humanity. Pullman says, I follow a tradition in moral philosophy that maintains that the proposition, all human beings qua humanity are possessed of dignity, functions as a logical primitive or fundamental axiom in moral discourse. So a question comes up for Pullman. How does the principle of respect for human dignity overcome the kind of ham-fisted formalism of which Kant was guilty in his attempts to apply his views? So, for example, requiring us to tell the truth to a murderer who's about to murder somebody. Well, Pullman says the beginnings of an answer to these questions can be found in a companion notion of dignity that is also around in our ordinary moral discourse. So here's an alternative or rival understanding of dignity. This is the notion of dignity we have in mind when we speak of living and dying with dignity, of conducting ourselves in a dignified manner, or even the dignity that might be attached to a certain station or office in life. Pullman says, while we have used the term, quote, basic dignity to identify the formal, universal, non-contingent conception of fundamental moral worth articulated to some degree by Kant, we can refer to this latter companion contingent conception of dignity under the rubric of personal dignity. Okay, so now you've got personal dignity on the one hand and basic dignity on the other hand. So, one of the things to point out here is the intent of the notion of personal dignity is to capture the fact that the self is a socially constructed entity. Indeed, Pullman says, depending on the context, it might be appropriate to use the term social dignity. to describe this socially constructed conception. So let's look at how these different kinds of dignity intersect. The abolition of slavery is an example Pullman brings up in the United States in the 19th century. This represented an intentional act of the American people to define themselves in a different way. Abolition, Pullman says, served to recognize the basic dignity of every human person, while at the same time providing the opportunity to enhance the personal dignity and the social dignity of all Americans. Now, if that's a way of understanding how abolition of slavery intersects with these two ideas of dignity, let's look at another one. Pullman says, however, given that the relationship between basic dignity and social or personal dignity is dynamic, we should expect that at times, particular social and personal self-understandings and expressions of dignity might have a reciprocal effect on our understanding of basic dignity. Okay, so here his example is the way in which the laws on therapeutic abortion have evolved in various Western democracies over much of the past half century. So he traces a little bit of the history of laws dealing with abortion in Western democracies and says that whereas many Western democracies have prohibited therapeutic abortion on largely religious grounds as a violation of the sanctity of human life, where the sanctity of human life serves as a religiously informed surrogate for the basic conception of dignity, things have evolved and changed as the religious connections have weakened. So, for example, he points out that when it comes to laws dealing with therapeutic abortion in Western democracies, he wants to say that many formerly restrictive laws were relaxed accordingly, and this is not to say that the notion of basic dignity was lost in the process, only that it was separated to some degree from its historical association with a particular religious tradition. While the principle of respect for basic dignity continued to constrain moral content, Pullman says, it did not dictate specific normative content in the manner it had done so previously when articulated in largely religious terms. So Pullman's wanting to say, if you look at the evolution of abortion laws in Western democracies, you still have an emphasis upon basic dignity. But it's not as simple as saying, well, the basic dignity is something we'll understand the way we've always understood it, as applying to, say, human fetuses from very early in pregnancy. So his conclusion of the essay is that not every single contemporary issue in bioethics can or even should be reduced to a discussion of this dynamic tension between the basic universal principle of respect for human dignity on the one hand and the socially and culturally contingent expression of social or personal dignity on the other hand. However, he says the key point for discussing debates in bioethics that he wants to note is this: some such universal moral principle is both necessary to the nature of moral discourse in general, while at the same time recognizing that such a principle is amenable to a variety of particularist expressions. The ongoing moral discourse, he says, that occurs within and between communities on these and other issues presupposes something like the principle of respect for human dignity.